The engine is screaming past its red line. Fuel gauges tremble near empty. Somewhere behind the canopy, enemy fighters are closing in, their silhouettes growing sharper against the cold blue sky at 20,000 feet. In moments like this, no pilot is thinking about regulations printed safely in an office thousands of miles away. Those rules were written for ideal conditions. War rarely offers those. Throughout the Second World War, aircraft manuals laid out strict limits: what could be modified, what must never be touched, what was considered unsafe or unauthorized. Engineers demanded margins of safety. Command demanded discipline. But pilots demanded something far simpler: to come home alive. Tonight, we count down 10 banned modifications airmen used anyway, quiet acts of defiance that bent doctrine to the breaking point. Stay with me, because the final modification crossed a line even wartime commanders struggled to justify. We begin with a change that seemed harmless, yet violated the most basic rule of aerial combat. Number 10. Removing armor plates for speed. Armor was meant to save a pilot's life. Steel plates behind the seat, reinforced panels around the cockpit, dead weight designed to stop shrapnel and heavy machine gun rounds. But steel also slowed an aircraft down. By 1944, some Luftwaffe pilots and even a handful of Allied airmen quietly began removing or thinning those plates. The logic was brutally simple. A lighter fighter climbed faster, turned tighter, and accelerated just enough to slip away from an enemy's guns. Official regulations strictly forbade it. Command prioritized survivability after being hit. Pilots prioritized not being hit at all. The performance gains were real. So were the consequences. One lucky burst could turn a cockpit into a coffin. If removing protection was one way to cheat the odds, some pilots chose to cheat physics instead. Number 9. Overboosting engines beyond redline limits. Every engine had a red line, a mechanical boundary no pilot was supposed to cross. Manifold pressure limits were printed clearly in the manual, especially for Merlin and Daimler-Benz power plants. Exceed them, and you risked tearing the heart out of the aircraft mid-air. Yet, in combat, those limits became suggestions. Pilots learned to bypass boost regulators or push throttle settings beyond approved tolerances, squeezing out a few desperate bursts of speed. Sustained overboost was strictly forbidden. It warped cylinders, seized pistons, and sometimes triggered catastrophic engine failure. Doctrine demanded preservation of valuable equipment. Reality demanded 5 more knots to escape a closing enemy. Sometimes that extra power meant survival. Sometimes it meant gliding home in silence. And this was only the beginning of how far pilots were willing to push their machines. But sometimes it wasn't about pushing harder. It was about carrying more. Number 8. Unauthorized external fuel tank configurations. Range became the new battlefield. As bombing campaigns pushed deeper into enemy territory, fighters were forced to escort heavy bombers far beyond their original design limits. Drop tanks offered a solution, but only under strict conditions. They were meant to be jettisoned before combat. Manuals were clear. In practice, pilots often kept them attached longer than authorized, stretching their range even during hostile contact. Some units experimented with improvised extended range configurations not cleared for aggressive maneuvering. The added drag reduced agility. The extra weight stressed wing mounts. And if struck, those tanks could ignite instantly. Command emphasized protocol and formation integrity. Pilots saw stranded bombers and chose endurance instead. Now the gamble didn't just risk one aircraft, it endangered entire squadrons. Range was survival over enemy territory, but firepower was survival inside it. Number 7. Field-installed extra guns. Firepower was survival in the sky, and for some crews, standard armament simply wasn't enough. In scattered airfields across Europe and the Pacific, mechanics and pilots quietly added extra machine guns or even cannons into wings and fuselages, modifications never approved by the factory. Each added weapon meant more weight, altered balance, and punishing recoil that could twist a wing under sustained fire. Engineers warned of structural fatigue and aerodynamic penalties. But bomber crews facing head-on attacks modified defensive arcs anyway, desperate to close blind spots in their coverage. Fighter pilots accepted slower climb rates in exchange for heavier bursts that could shred an enemy in seconds. Doctrine valued precision engineering. Frontline reality valued overwhelming lethality. The aircraft grew heavier, more unstable, more strained. If adding weapons made aircraft heavier, some pilots decided to remove something far more dangerous. Number 6. Removing oxygen systems for low-altitude combat. At high altitude, oxygen meant clarity, coordination, survival. Without it, a pilot could black out in minutes. Yet some airmen made the deliberate choice to remove portions of their oxygen systems entirely. The reason was weight. By stripping bottles and related equipment, they shaved off precious pounds, gaining marginal improvements in acceleration and handling. But the decision came with a commitment. They were locking themselves into low-altitude combat. Climb too high, and hypoxia would end the fight before the enemy did. Official doctrine demanded multi-role flexibility. These modifications erased it. A pilot who made this choice narrowed his own battlefield, gambling that speed near the deck would outweigh altitude advantage. Now the modifications were no longer cosmetic. They touched life support itself. But while some stripped systems away, others installed something far more volatile. Number 5. Improvised rocket mounts. By the middle of the war, bomber formations had become flying fortresses, dense boxes of steel and defensive firepower. Standard machine guns often weren't enough to break them, so some fighter units took matters into their own hands. Rockets, originally designed for specific ground attack platforms, were field-mounted onto fighters never engineered to carry them. Makeshift rails were bolted beneath wings. Wiring was adapted, balance shifted. The added weight and drag altered center of gravity, sometimes unpredictably. Engineers warned of stress fractures along wing spars and hardpoints. Without formal retrofit approval, these modifications were technically banned. Accuracy was inconsistent, but raw explosive force could scatter bomber formations in seconds. It was a desperate solution to a desperate threat. And what came next didn't just risk mechanical failure, it risked the pilot's own aircraft catching fire. Because fuel, when weaponized incorrectly, becomes a threat to everyone. Number 4. Illicit fuel mixture tweaks. Fuel wasn't just fuel. It was chemistry balanced to the edge of combustion. Manuals prescribed precise mixture ratios for every altitude and throttle setting. Deviate too far, and the engine could knock, detonate, or erupt into flame. But wartime shortages rarely delivered perfect supplies. Lower octane fuel found its way into tanks meant for higher performance. Rather than accept reduced power, some pilots and ground crews recalibrated mixture settings beyond approved limits, coaxing extra thrust from unstable blends. It was a quiet conspiracy between cockpit and runway. Doctrine demanded uniformity and mechanical discipline. Reality offered scarcity and enemy pressure. Each adjustment made the engine less predictable, more volatile, closer to failure under strain. Mechanical risks were one thing. What some crews did next blurred tactical lines entirely. Number 3. Unauthorized bomb loads on fighters. Fighters were built for speed and agility, not heavy payloads. Yet as the war dragged into its later years, necessity began to override design philosophy. In both Europe and the Pacific, pilots loaded bombs onto aircraft already operating at the edge of their structural tolerance, sometimes exceeding recommended weight limits entirely. The added mass-strained wing mounts and hardpoints never intended for repeated stress. Climb rate suffered. Turning ability diminished. In a dogfight, those extra pounds could prove fatal. Official policy discouraged overburdening multi-role fighters for precisely that reason. But desperation changed calculations. Airfields needed suppressing. Bridges needed destroying. Targets had to be hit, even if the return trip felt uncertain. Some pilots accepted missions that bordered on one-way probabilities, reshaping their aircraft into something they were never meant to be. But bombs weren't the only controversial payload some pilots carried. Not every payload came stamped from a factory with official approval. In certain theaters, crews adapted or improvised incendiary devices, modified munitions designed to spread fire beyond their intended scope. Documentation is scarce, references often buried or omitted entirely from polished after-action reports. The tactical logic was clear: fire denied cover, destroyed supply caches, and flushed out entrenched resistance. But the humanitarian risks were undeniable. Flames did not distinguish between military targets and what surrounded them. Command structures often operated in ambiguity. Quiet tolerance on the ground. Public denial in official channels. The line between sanctioned warfare and improvised escalation blurred in smoke and heat. The moral weight of these decisions lingered long after engines cooled. And yet, even this wasn't the most controversial modification of the war, because the final entry wasn't about power, it was about deception. Some of the boldest modifications never touched the engine or wings at all. Instead, they manipulated perception. Pilots deliberately altered their aircraft to appear crippled, loosening panels, venting controlled smoke, even flying with deliberate instability to mimic catastrophic damage. The goal was bait. An enemy fighter spotting a wounded aircraft might abandon caution, closing in for an easy kill. That overconfidence created a narrow window for sudden reversal and lethal surprise. Technically, such deception skirted identification and conduct norms, drifting into ethical gray space. It was psychological warfare played at full throttle. Ingenuity blurred into perfidy. Survival eclipsed honor codes. At 20,000 feet, regulations dissolved, and war rewrote its own rules. Manuals promised safety. War delivered mortality. In the space between regulation and survival, pilots reshaped aviation history with choices rarely printed in official records. If you want more untold frontline truths from World War II aviation, subscribe. Comment which modification surprised you most. And share this with someone who thinks war followed the rule book. Because history isn't just what was written, it's what was survived.